Okay, welcome to Sexual Assault Advocates Training on Sexual Assault Statistics and Realities. So, some quick ground rules. Be sure to watch the entire training. And also, when you complete the training, be sure to email the Director of Outreach the name of the training and the date that you completed the training. So we'll go ahead and get started on some sexual assault statistics. So the prevalence of sexual assault, it really differs among different factors. Firstly, determining the number of the statistics is difficult, and it always depends on reporting measures. In addition to that, every state has a different definition of what they consider sexual assault. So it's important to have a clear understanding of what that definition is and also the different types of research methods that may be used in order to gain a deeper understanding of the pervasiveness of sexual assault. Understand that the prevalence of sexual assault has been accurately depicted through several national surveys. So when it comes to national prevalence, we understand that we collected data from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey. And what we found is that among women, 1 in 5 women experience attempted or completed rape in their lifetime. Of that, nearly 81% of female survivors will report experiencing their very first sexual assault before age 25, and 42.2% will report it before the age of 18. We also know that 51.1% that report being assaulted by an intimate partner. When it comes to men, we know that men will experience sexual assault. 1 in 33 men will actually do that. 52.4% of male survivors will report being assaulted by acquaintances, and 27.8% of male victims will experience their very first rape before the age of 10. So that will bring more than about 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before the age of 18. Now, when it comes to children and adolescents, we know that 30% of all sexual assault cases involve children under 12, which means the majority of these assaults against minors are committed by someone that they know to the family, that know them, the family, the teachers, or even the coaches. So you want to understand also that collectively, 20 million of the 112 million women in the US have been raped during their lifetime. In addition, acquaintance rape is far more prevalent than the stranger danger scenarios that sometimes the media portrays when it comes to sexual assault. And nationally, only 25% of survivors actually report sexual assault due to the fear of stigma, shame, and retaliation. So when we talk about statistics among Texas, this is based on the Institute of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault by University of Texas, Austin, in a study in 2015. And what they found was 6.3 million, which equates to 4.2 million women and 2.1 million men have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime in the state of Texas. We know that sexual assault affects all genders. However, women are twice as likely to be assaulted than men. 70% of survivors in Texas actually knew their assailant, which meant it was either a friend, an acquaintance, or a relative. 65.2% of victims report multiple victimizations. So out of the US, Texas actually ranks in the top 10 states for reported sexual assaults. Now, of course, there is a differentiation between rural and urban divide, where we know that reporting rates tend to be lower in rural area due to lack of resources, access to services, and cultural stigma. Now, the study for higher education, where we're talking about college students, this also was conducted in 2015 by a study in UT Austin. They found that 32% of female college students in Texas reported experiencing sexual harassment or violence during their time on campus. Of those cases, 20% of them involved incapacitation through drugs or alcohol. So some factors that affect prevalence, of course, there's a strong cultural adherence to the gender roles that we may understand between men and women that can also perpetuate silence. Some lack of some comprehensive sex education that also includes what consent is and what consent is not. When we break down sexual assault by gender, we know that women are significantly more likely to be victims of sexual assault due to power imbalances. And some of those common forms of assault are, of course, acquaintance rape, date rape, or also intimate partner violence. Some barriers may include the fear of just being blamed or even being asked questions like, what were you wearing? As to make the notion that what a woman wears actually has some role into her sexual assault. When it comes to male survivors, there are certain stereotypes that portray men as masculinity. So a lot of people do not understand how men can be raped, and that notion actually attributes to the underreporting happened among male sexual assault survivors. That notion that men can't be raped, or it's not actually assault if the perpetrator actually is a female. So studies show that male survivors are actually 3.5 times more likely to develop PTSD due to the lack of supportive services. When it comes to LGBTQ and even non-binary individuals, 50% of transgender individuals will experience sexual violence in their lifetime. And those barriers, of course, include just the lack of that inclusive supportive services and, of course, the fear of discrimination. When you're talking about the intersectionality between sexual assault and LGBTQ, we know that higher rates of violence happens in communities of color, particularly Black or Indigenous LGBTQ individuals. So when we break down sexual assault by age group, we know that the highest risk group is among our adolescents, and this is from the ages of 14 to 18. They will face the highest rate of specifically acquaintance and date rape. In a survey that was actually conducted also by the UT Austin, we noted that 54% of males and 31% of females believed it was actually acceptable to coerce sex if the partner actually, quote unquote, led them on by flirting or even changing their mind. And then you know that many adolescent survivors do not report it just due to judgment from their peers or even their adults, or even just not wanting to let their parents know. When it comes to college kids, this is the range of the age of 18 to 24. We know that college women are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than women in other age groups. There are, of course, certain environmental factors such as, substance abuse or alcohol related assaults that happen during college parties or even social events. And sometimes there also is a lack of institutional support in that reporting process and also the results of that process. We also understand that when it comes to elderly survivors, so these are those that actually require caregiver support or even nursing support. So sexual assault among elderly individuals often perpetuated by caregivers or family members. And some of those reporting challenges are duly dependent on that perpetrator for care. So the perpetrator is actually the caregiver, and so they don't want to report because they know that they need the service. Sometimes there's always also cognitive impairments that actually prevent accurate reporting. Some key factors that actually contribute also to the prevalence of sexual assault are those cultural myths and misconceptions. There's certain beliefs that, well, she changed her mind the last minute, so it wasn't an assault. Or she was drunk. What did she expect? When it comes to gender socialization, these are the difference between how men and women perceive it. Men are often socialized to conquer and score or even pursue sex as a means to prove their masculinity, where women are socialized to protect their virtue and avoid situations that could label them as being promiscuous. These common narratives actually reinforce harmful expectations that often blame survivors as if they were the blame for their sexual assault. We can't always exclude the media's influence. The media has a really huge depiction on how society views it, sexual assault. This is common in certain popular movies and ads that portray that romantic persistence. If I just keep just going after you. Women love to be chased. Men feel more masculine when they're chasing women, and that borders on the concept of coercion and manipulation, and also normalizing harassment and disrespect for boundaries. So what are some impacts to the prevalence? Well, we know that survivors have different reasons for why they don't choose to report sexual assault. Now, of course, we know that shame and fear is a huge reason as to why they don't. Some survivors just feel like, if I report, will I even be believed? Or will I even be blamed for the assault? Some actually fear retaliation, especially in cases that happen within the workplace, if it's that supervisor, employee type of scenario, or even domestic violence. When it comes to judicial system barriers, some survivors are often questioned about, what was your sexual history? What were you wearing? Or why you were in that particular location. The actual way that sometimes the judicial system asks or interrogates survivors can also make them not want to report or go through with the interview. And that leads to lack of trauma-informed interview processes, which can sometimes re-traumatize survivors. So when it comes to judicial outcomes, we know that, especially when it comes to conviction rates, acquaintance date rape cases have notoriously low conviction rates due to the lack of hard evidence. Examples, visible injuries. If there's not an injury that is seen, how do you know that the sexual assault happened? Is that kind of notion. Survivors also have to relive their trauma multiple times during the legal process. They have to tell their story when they report it, then when they have to sit down with the investigator. You're going back over intricate details, which can be very overwhelming for survivors. And then there's the notion that, well, what if people are false reporting? So what we know that false reports do happen, but they only account for 2 to 8% of all sexual assault reports. The media also tends to sensationalize false accusations, fueling skepticism of survivors. So if I actually report, who will actually believe me? Or will they think that I'm actually lying about the assault in itself? So here is an image that kind of talks about the extent of how this really is not just an individual problem. It is a social problem, but it actually is a state and a national issue. We know that among Texas, there are 6.3 million adult Texans have experienced some form of sexual assault in their lifetime. And when you kind of look like, hey, we see 413,000 have experienced it in this same year. So understand that this was in 2015. So when it comes to victimization, when they break it down by gender and age, among female and male victims, you'll see that 2 in 5 women as opposed to 1 in 5 men. And you also see the charts in the graph to show the statistical numbers in the lifetime versus their ages if they are an adult age 18 or over, adolescents age 14 to 17, and children that are age 13 and under. So let's go over some sexual assault realities. So the key notion is that sexual assault is not limited to violent ambushes. We talked about that, and how the understanding that many people, when they think about sexual assault, they think about that violent situation. And what we know that it actually is not just limited to strangers. often it involves people that the survivor knows or someone that they trusted. So in fact, we know the majority of assaults actually involve someone known to the perpetrator or known to the survivor, such as friends, partners, or family members. We know that only 10% of reported cases actually involve a stranger. So what are some survivor perceptions? Many survivors even question whether their experience actually counts as real sexual assault due to certain myths and other cultural programming. They may doubt themselves because of non-stereotypical circumstances like, well, there was no physical struggle, so I didn't fight back. Or this was a person that I have had previous intimate relations with. So if that happens, is this still considered sexual assault? And so we know that the impact of these misconceptions could lead to underreporting because they fear of being judged and fear of being believed. Some may even internalize the blame, like, I knew I shouldn't have drank that much, or I knew I shouldn't have went out by myself, you know. And when a survivor actually tends to take the blame, they tend to avoid seeking support because they really believe that they are at fault for the sexual assault. So what are some common myths? So we want to make sure that we eradicate those myths that are actually believed in society. So one of the important myths are real rape involves a violent attack by a stranger. When in reality, we know that actually most assaults involve that acquaintances relationship or even those intimate partners. To give an example, Marcus was sexually assaulted by a coworker after they had drinks at an office event. Marcus hesitated to report it because he was unsure if even men could be victims too. So we see here in that example that Marcus didn't want to report because we really don't hear as much, or we know that there is a huge difference when it comes to men versus women actually reporting. And perhaps Marcus just doesn't know that men can actually be victims too. Remember, we talked about those gender socialization rules, right? Myth number 2, survivors must fight back for it to count as rape. So the notion that you do have to actually try to stop the rape. When in reality, many perpetrators actually use coercion, like constantly trying to persuade you into doing it through methods of guilt, or even if I can get you a little drunk and a little relaxed, rather than actually exhibiting physical force. When it comes to certain myths, number 3 is a previous relationship doesn't mean that it was an assault. So if I was in a relationship with someone else previously, then it can't be assault if I've actually consented to that before. So when reality is consent must be freely given for every encounter, every circumstances, regardless of the relationship's history. Another myth is sexual assault only happens to women. Well, we do know that men among anyone can be a victim of sexual assault, regardless of gender. So we know that 1 in 33 men in the US actually experience attempted or even completed rape. For example, David was afraid to seek help because of the stigma surrounding male survivors, right? And that could be on all levels. Like, what if he wanted to kind of like come forward, and the notion of how he would be perceived going to law enforcement trying to report this. There are several different things that survivors, especially male survivors, can go through thinking about, when it comes to reporting. We also know that another myth is only people who dress provocatively or flirt get assaulted. So that is simply not true. Sexual assault is all about power and control. It doesn't matter what you're wearing, or it doesn't even matter how your behavior is. For example, Maria was assaulted and she just happened to be wearing sweatpants at home by someone she trusted. It doesn't matter if you're wearing something a little more revealing versus just comfortable wear. Sexual assault can happen either way. We know that survivors of all gender, ages, and appearance can report assault. In addition to another myth is most survivors actually lie about being assaulted. So we know in reality some false reports are rare, between 2 to 8%, but many survivors feel they won't be believed. In addition to another myth is people can avoid assault if you're careful, like we can prevent sexual assault. And even though we can do certain measures or there are safety plans that we can do, we know that assaults often happen even despite taking necessary precautions. So survivors should never be blamed for the actions of their assailants. For example, Janice didn't drink and she avoided walking alone at night, but she was still assaulted by someone she knew. Well, thank you so much for the very first part of our sexual assault statistics and reality training seminar. Please be sure to let me know once you've watched this in full. Thank you.